Laramie Hirsch writes, "It seems to me that as oligarchs rule, things become more chaotic, and as the population grows, power seems to solidify into an untouchable central authority. Charles touched on this in his book Star-Spangled Crown, when he discussed the boroughs and the burghs of the British Isles. A more modern example of runaway oligarchy, I think, is America's current untouchable political class. But for your on-the-street layman, what is the difference between an oligarchy and a monarchy?"
Well, the difference is actually pretty big. A monarchy is, of course, a form of government where you have a single monarch, usually, but not always hereditary, which is at once legitimized and limited by tradition and religion and various other factors. An oligarchy is a ruling class, which may or may not be responsible to someone or other. You can have a monarchy and an oligarchy at the same time. You can have a republic and an oligarchy at the same time. You can have any form of government you like with an oligarchy. But the question is, how responsive is that oligarchy to the actual needs of its subjects? What kind of check is there on its power? In some societies, you can have like Venice, for instance, which was a republic of sorts, although they had a duke, the Doge. There was an oligarchy who, they were the ones who voted, nobody else did. But both their religion, the almost crushing weight of custom in Venice, and a number of other factors, kept them fairly efficient as rulers for a long time. What you really have a problem with, and this I think has happened in our own country today, is when you get an oligarchy that is untrammeled by any kind of tradition, has no effective check on its power, and no real belief in anything save itself. When you have an oligarchy that no longer cares about the welfare of its subjects, then you acquire a parasite that will kill the host, unless they're overthrown or get a new oligarchy.
Okay, well, what would be an example of a good check on an oligarchy, so that they're not a parasite?
Well, as I say, I brought up Venice, but usually when you've got an hereditary king, you've got a good check
Oh, yeah.
on the oligarchy, partly because he's hereditary, partly because he may rule through them, but he also has an appeal to the people below them. Mm-hmm. You see, the king has to try to be father to all his subjects, not just those on top.
What about in our system?
Well, in our system, there's no check on the oligarchy at all.
Yeah.
And the oligarchy, moreover, have no belief that would restrain them. They have a belief structure of sorts, but it's completely self-aggrandizing. The problem with it, though, is it doesn't really confer legitimacy on them. What Mrs. Clinton was going on about last night was really the credo of the oligarchy. The so-called woman's right to choose, infanticide. Mm-hmm. So-called marriage equality, sodomy. These are what our ruling class are into. And it's not just sexual stuff. I mean, that's a small potatoes, really. But it's all economic, all this worldly. Donald, who certainly has been a member of that oligarchy, at least in financial terms, for a long time, he identified a couple of other members of it. George Soros, Warren Buffett. Mm-hmm. And really, George Soros, alongside Rupert Murdoch, is like a poster child for the modern oligarchy. Because he's not this and he's not that. It's not an oligarchy that's based on any ethnic unity. It's not based on anything other than money and power. That's why it's so hard to identify. But you look at a man like, Rupert Murdoch. Now, Rupert Murdoch is a world player like Soros. He knows no boundaries. He gave up his Australian citizenship. In Australia, he's the bankroller of the Australian Republican movement. In the United States, he's the owner of Fox News and so-called Republican. Mm-hmm. But then in Britain, he was Tony Blair's paymaster and the Mother Bountiful of the Labour Party. Now, these are very different roles.
Yeah.
And you would say, gee, what's his ideology? Well, his ideology is Rupert Murdoch. The problem, though, is that you cannot sustain over a long period of time an oligarchy that's like that. If all they see is themselves and their own power, their own whatever it is going on, those little pointed heads of theirs, they must either be replaced or the fabric of society crumble. One or the other. I mean, to bring it down to its most basic, a society that cannot sustain itself via population will die. You have to have bodies to bleed for you and to be milked for your treasure. If you don't have them, you don't have them. The problem, of course, is that the way these folk see to remedy that is to abolish nations and bring in all sorts of immigrants to take up the slack. Well, you can do that, but then you change the nature of the country. And the problem is, too, the people you bring in will not have the habits of obedience to the oligarchy that your native-born did. So you play with fire. You know, the old joke about the woodman who was sitting on a branch in a tree and was busy sawing it.
Yeah.
And then didn't understand why he fell down and broke his neck. You know, it was a little too tough for him to catch on to. Our oligarchs are the same way. They don't realize that they're doing themselves. And they don't care. So, what's not to like?
Okay.